The phone hacking scandal has exposed some of the dirty little secrets of British public life. Journalists, it seems, turn to crime to gain a competitive edge. Police chiefs fail to investigate, and political leaders look the other way. Rupert Murdoch's British media business is now under intense scrutiny, but so too are the country's most powerful institutions. I'm joined by three guests: a former Labour Home Secretary, a former boss of the BBC, and a member of London's Metropolitan Police Authority. Will the hacking scandal really change Britain? Jacqui Smith, Greg Dyke and Chris Boothman, welcome all of you to Hard Talk. Let me start with you, Jacqui Smith, former Home Secretary. Do you think Britain has been found out? Do you think this is a country that has, for a long time, turned a blind eye to corruption at the top table?
I think it's been a pretty important period of time for some of the sort of pillars of the establishment in Britain over the last fortnight. Who would have imagined that we would have a situation where we would see the resignation of the chief executive of a major media company in the country, the resignation of the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the closure of a major newspaper, the foiling of a major media takeover, and a lot of pressure put onto the political class about their relationship with the media. I suppose the answer to the question is whether or not, at the end of the investigations which are now underway, there really is a fundamental change in all of those relationships or not.
Yeah, but I want to stick with the idea, the question, whether Britain in a way has been found out. We're rather good at preaching to the rest of the world about governance, about standards and ethics in public life, but maybe ours, for quite a long time, haven't been too good at home.
Well, I think we've known for a long time that there's something wrong with the tabloid press.
Is it just the tabloid press?
Well, no, I'll go further. I think it is mainly the tabloid press, yes. I think we've known there's something wrong with the tabloid press. I think we've known there's something equally wrong about the relationship between senior politicians and News International. And I don't know about the police. I can't work out whether this is just a one-off or whether this is endemic.
Well, that's honesty, that's good. So let's turn to a man who should know, at least have views on it. Chris Boothman, you're a lawyer in London, but you also sit on the Metropolitan Police Authority. On this question of police corruption, which is a truly important part of this unfolding story, has it surprised you?
Not really. I mean, there's always been a level of corruption, and I'm not actually so concerned about the corruption. I'm more concerned about the corporate governance issue, which is, you know, why supposedly highly paid public servants don't seem to know what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. And I think there is an endemic issue there. There is an issue about the culture of the service at its upper levels.
Sorry, are you saying it's more about incompetence than amorality or actual out-and-out corruption?
Well, yes, or gross naivety. I mean, people at that level, being paid the amounts of money that they're paid, should know better.
Well, maybe they do know better. Maybe you're being a bit naive. They do know better, but they've taken a decision. And this gets to my broader question about whether Britain's standards are quite as high in public life as some would like to believe.
Well, there's no doubt that the standards need to be much higher in the service, because over the years there have been a number of questionable decisions made by senior police officers which are suspect.
Well, I want to go on, Jacqui.
I wrote something the other day about whether or not there were similarities between this and the MP's expenses issue, and I tell you what I think. I don't think that people are inherently corrupt in tabloid newspapers, but I think what happens is you develop a way of working similar to the way that Parliament did about the way it paid MPs, that starts off being okay, and over a period of time, because there isn't any external challenge, becomes something that actually goes far beyond anything that is acceptable. And people sort of within a closed world justify it to themselves, but eventually it needs the sort of shock that we've seen in the last fortnight to really put a light onto.
I mean, one of the interesting things is why the tabloid presses in other countries, other industrialised, developed countries, aren't quite like ours. Because I think that is true. I saw a letter in The Guardian the other day from journalists from around the world saying, you know, we've long looked to the British press for a lead and for inspiration, but frankly, in recent years, some of the standards we've seen, particularly in the tabloid press, have been so low that we feel we've got to speak out about it and issue a warning.
Well, they've become more competitive, of course. I mean, you know, newspapers are declining. Sales of newspapers are declining anyway. The advertising is moving online. They've become more competitive. But I think Jacqui's right. It's about the culture of organisations, probably about the Met, certainly about newspapers. I mean, the culture within that newspaper, within the News of the World, was that you just did this. This is what you did to get good stories.
Do you have any confidence, and you know, from my very broad opening question, you leapt on News International as being the key to this at the very beginning. Of course, it is at the centre of the story, but do you believe it's enough to think that, you know, in the end, fix News International, clean that out, and you've essentially fixed the problem?
Oh, no, no, no. You've got to do something much more profound. You've got to have a degree of regulation of newspapers in this country, which means if someone complains, it goes to somewhere independent, it's properly investigated, and if the finding is against them, you can fine the newspapers involved. That's how you'll be. I actually, to answer your question at the very beginning, do you think this is a sea change? Yes, I think it is. I think actually there's a massive opportunity to sort out the tabloid press in this country.
Well, before we get to that, and I will get to that, I promise, I just want to think more about Murdoch. We saw the extraordinary pictures of father and son before the Parliamentary Select Committee, something we've never seen before. Murdoch's on the defensive in a new way. But do you have confidence that the various investigations that have now been launched will get to the core of the truth of what exactly happened in this thing we call the phone hacking scandal?
I would like to say yes, but of course we have had a history of not quite getting there up until this point.
I think including governments that you were part of.
Absolutely. I think something fundamentally changed at the point at which the Millie Dowler case came to the fore, because I think up to that point, lots of people involved, politicians had sort of thought, well, this is something that we don't really like the look of, but it is not something that the public is really massively engaged in.
And the reminders of those who don't remember that Millie Dowler was the young girl who was murdered, and we now know that her mobile phone was hacked into and actually messages were erased in what has an act that has shocked the British nation.
And this was the point, of course, at which everybody, clearly the Murdochs and politicians, realised that this was something that the public were now going to be very engaged and worried about.
Yeah, but the thing is, I suppose, that you've always said, Greg Dyke, that the problem is News International is too powerful in this country.
Oh, it is.
And the fact is, News International, yes, the Murdochs on the defensive, but is still very powerful in this country.
No, it's gone.
It's gone.
It's gone. It went last week sometime. It went when you saw the Murdoch. Never again are we going to have to be lectured by the Murdochs, the Murdoch family, on what we should have in the media in this country. It's gone. Honestly, it went yesterday. It went because the politicians, leading politicians, will no longer be comfortable having the sort of relationships they've had with these people in the past. It's a sea change.
And Chris Boothman, you've been following very closely the relationship between News International and the police. We've had two very senior policemen, including the Commissioner of the Met, resign. But, you know, the fact remains there that it's not entirely clear that the police have the resources and or the commitment to follow through on this truth-telling that is now supposed to happen. Do you believe they do?
I think what's required is a lot more than has been announced in terms of the various inquiries. I mean, I actually think that the issue with the police service is partly to do with the accountability model that we've got at the moment, which is quite old, which the government are proposing to change, and they're saying that we're going to have a tougher system when, in fact, if you look at the detail, police will have even more autonomy than they've had in the past.
On this question of accountability and transparency, knowing what the police are actually up to, I mean, did you have any idea before it became public knowledge in the last few days that senior police officers, the very top of the Met, had been lunching and dining and socially consorting with top figures at News International for years? It's
emerged over the last few weeks, really, when questions have been asked. But
shouldn't you have been asking questions long before?
The problem with the current model is that we have limited powers to find out what's going on, and generally we only find out after the event. I mean, there is a need for a modern framework for police accountability that, for instance, might include a judge supervising serious investigations, because at the heart of this issue...
You mean ongoing investigation?
Absolutely.
It's going to entirely change the way the police do their work.
Absolutely. And at the heart of this issue is an issue about the conduct of investigations, which, if you look back, you'll see the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the Levi Belfield investigation. There are a number of high-profile investigations that have not gone the way they should have gone. And
it's a fascinating idea. I can see many problems with it. I wonder if you can, Jacqui Smith, former Home Secretary.
I can see, I mean, it's a sort of investigating magistrate type model similar to that they have in France, where I'm not sure that has necessarily meant that every investigation is more effective than it is here. I mean, I would certainly agree with Chris that there are some high-profile investigations that haven't gone right. I think the interesting point about the accountability model is that, of course, everywhere else apart from in London, the proposal is to introduce a directly elected politician to hold the police chief to account. Now, you know, I'm sceptical about that model, but actually I think it is in even more trouble now after what's happened in the last few weeks than it was previously. You know, the House of Lords, our House of Lords, had asked the government to think again about that model. I think they'll feel that their hand has been strengthened. Yeah,
Prime Minister David Cameron has just said, this is a quote from him, "This whole affair raises huge issues about the ethics and practices of our police." But are you suggesting you don't have confidence that this government has answers to the questions raised?
I don't think the answer to this is the single politician holding to account the single chief constable. I don't think that's going to be the answer to it. I think there are, you know, this has uncovered questions about police culture in the way in which we talked about tabloid culture. I personally, you know, I mean, I'm not an expert on what every police officer gets up to. I genuinely, just as I don't think that every journalist is breaking the law, I don't think that every police officer is, consorting with newspapers in a way in which they shouldn't, or taking money, for example. The problem is that now this has been raised, it has got to be properly uncovered, and we've got to be clear about the nature of it and what could be done to prevent that.
Sure, and I just wonder how badly damaged you think public trust, public confidence in Britain's policing is.
It'll recover. I mean, it's obviously damaged now, and I think it is an opportunity, therefore, to look at the way we organise the police service in this country. But I don't think it's irreparably damaged.
Let's talk a little bit more about reactions on the media front. You know, the police is very important. We've talked about that. Let's talk about whether the Labour Party is on dangerous ground right now, trying to make something partisan out of what has happened in the relationships, for example, between David Cameron and the Murdoch empire, not least his decision to hire Andy Coulson, a former News of the World editor, to be part of his communications team. It looks as though Labour believes they've got a partisan issue they can run with here, and I just wonder whether that's going to be a mistake.
Well, remember that what has happened in this whole process is that actually Ed Miliband has been presented with the moment that has enabled him to show some pretty strong and good leadership, and he's turned round a lot of people's views of his leadership. And unsurprisingly, he has run with that. And actually, it hasn't only been on a party political basis. It's been, you know, some quite broad issues.
If one looks at his line of attack now, Jacqui Smith, he believes, it seems, that the best, most productive political point for him to make is that Cameron has got to get on his knees and apologise again and again for ever thinking of appointing Andy Coulson. Calls it a catastrophic mistake, and that's the thing he constantly hammers home at. Surely missing the point that a much wider issue here is that successive governments, political leaders of every stripe over the last 20 years have been in bed with the Murdoch empire.
Yes, but there are two, that is a fair point. But you wouldn't miss the opportunity, I don't think, if you were a leader of the opposition, to point out a fundamental error of judgment of the Prime Minister in employing somebody who, at the very least, was under a cloud at the point at which he was appointed. However, Stephen, I do think you are right that there is a broader issue that all politicians have a responsibility to address about relationships of all political parties with the media.
I could quote you ad nauseum. Let me just limit it to a couple. Peter Mandelson, you know, one of the architects of New Labour, said just a few days ago, he said, we simply chose to be cowed because we were too fearful to do otherwise. And you know as well as I do the famous Lance Price quote when he was one of the communications guys at Number 10 working for Tony Blair, saying that, you know, there are only 3 people who really counted apart from Blair himself. That was Gordon Brown, John Prescott and Rupert Murdoch. I mean, that was the reality, wasn't it?
Oh yes, there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt that, I mean, that's why I think Miliband is chasing the wrong line, because I think not him, but his predecessors are as guilty as Cameron.
And let's not forget, sorry to interrupt, Ed Miliband himself went to News International to appoint his chief of communications.
Yes, I honestly think, and you can see why it all started really back under Mrs Thatcher, who was very close to Rupert Murdoch and nodded through all sorts of things that, in terms of power, shouldn't have been nodded through. Labour have been in opposition a long time. In the end, they did. I know this from personal experience because I sent someone along to talk to Blair at that time to say, you know, be careful. And
instead, when was that? Oh, well, before he came into power.
Yes, I was running London Weekend Television, and I sent my head of corporate affairs along to warn Blair, this man is getting too much power. You know, he's got 30-odd% of the national press, 40-odd% of the Sunday press, and B-Sky B at that time was turning into a very powerful economic organisation. And I sent someone along, and the response from Blair was, yes, I've been thinking about that. I think I'll have to do a deal with this man. So it completely backfired on me, but it told you what happened. They did a deal.
Jonathan Powell wrote a very interesting piece earlier this week as well, when he said, first of all...
And Jonathan Powell being
Jonathan Powell,
Chief of Staff, Tony Blair's right-hand man. And
he said... actually, which I agree with, it was completely right in 1994 when Tony Blair took over as leader to try to do something, because, you know, let's not forget, for the Labour Party there was a very strong feeling back in 1994-95 that the media were against us. Remember the Sun headline at the point at which we lost the election in 1992, you know, the last person to leave the country turn out the light, with our then leader Neil Kinnock's face in it. Now, I'm not saying that's the reason why we lost the election, but remember there was a very strong feeling that it was difficult for us to get our message over because we had nobody in the media who was willing to listen to us.
But hang on a minute.
It was right at that point to try to build relationships with people who were going to enable us to get our
after all of the sackcloth and ashes has been dealt with over the next few weeks and months, and politicians, my goodness, are going to be very careful about the short-term interaction with big media players. The reality is the same, though, isn't it? I mean, there are big selling newspapers in the UK that politicians want to be on the right side of. They'll still want to be on the right side of them because this is a democracy and you want to reach out to people and influence their opinion.
They will, but all sorts of things are going to change. I mean, if you say who you've been talking to, if the Prime Minister's got to start saying, look, I had a meeting with this, I had a meeting with that.
And that now is going to be instituted.
And that's going to be instituted. That will begin to change it. Just like you talk to MPs today and they're scared to death of putting anything on their expenses. So it's going to be the same, I think, in government. And I think that's really encouraging for the future of a democracy.
So we get the much more transparent, accountable sort of description of the relationships, the horse riding or the lunches and the dinners, whatever happens, we will know about in future. But let's just, you alluded to it, Greg Dyke, but Chris Boothman, I want to ask you about this. Let's talk a little bit about active new regulation of the press. I mean, you're a lawyer in London. You know how it works at the moment, and I just wonder whether you believe all this talk of getting rid of the old press complaint system, self-regulation, putting some statutory body in place which has real teeth and real punitive powers, is that going to change the way the press works in the UK?
I think that's where you have to go, because in the world of regulation, everyone knows that as well as having a carrot to encourage people to do the right thing, you have to have the stick, you know. And for this country to have had arrangements where there is no stick for so many years is one of the reasons why people have been behaving the way they have been.
Greg, you've come out in favour of a bit of stick, but I just want to quote to you a friend and colleague, no doubt, David Elstein, big player in television and the media over many years. He says, if we go down the route of what's called an Ofcom style solution for the press, that is much stricter regulation, he says, basically a licensed press, something we haven't had since 1869. Ofcom would decide everything from who could and could not publish newspapers to forcing divestment of titles, and that, he says, would be very worrying for Britain.
Well, I don't believe that, you see. I've disagreed with David about most things over 20 years, and I disagree with him entirely on that. Broadcasting is regulated. This is regulated. Has that undermined your ability to ever ask a question?
No, of course not, but broadcasting's different, isn't it? First of all, it's a much more limited medium, and second of all, the expectation in broadcasting upon the BBC and all the other main broadcasters is that we will be balanced. There's inbuilt balance requirement. That's never been the case in the press. Now, you sit in the press now.
No, there doesn't have to be a requirement for balance.
No.
What there has to be a requirement for is accuracy
Yes.
and fairness.
Yeah. I think there are two challenges here, aren't there? First of all, there is a serious look at the concentration of media ownership. So there's the sort of business competition argument. That doesn't require you to... That suggests that you want a more diverse, truly competitive
So
market.
are you saying that given the reach of the Murdoch newspapers, he would have to... I mean, obviously he's closed the News of the World, but he may open a Sunday Sun. You're saying he would actively be forced to divest himself of some of his newspapers because we wouldn't allow anybody to have that share?
Well, I do think we need, and Ed Miliband has said, I do think we need to look again at that concentration of power and how we might go about making sure it wasn't so concentrated. But actually, I think Greg's absolutely right. The other thing we need to look at is the accountability, the putting right of mistakes, the stick, if you like, that means that there is some form of redress when something that is wrong that is reported or some totally unreasonable story gets into the papers.
Yeah,
the trouble at the moment is
an unreasonable story. I mean, this gets difficult very quickly. Jacqui Smith, you know better than me.
I should judge it.
No, but let's just think about the way the MP's expenses scandal was revealed. I mean, the Daily Telegraph got its information from if I can put it this way, pretty dodgy source. It's not clear quite how it got in it, but the information that was on the data discs which they got, it may be that they paid money for it, may be that a new, much tougher press regime would not have liked that at all, and the information may never have seen the light of day, and actually, people like you wouldn't have been embarrassed.
And I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing. I think there are certain issues that have to do with powerful people where there potentially is a justification for doing something like that. So I don't argue about that. What I do argue about is that subsequently, I think there was, obviously there was a feeding frenzy. Some of that was correct, some of it was incorrect. I, for example, went to the Press Complaints Commission 4 times. On each of those 4 occasions, my appeal was upheld. But you wouldn't know that was the case because, frankly, you can put an apology where you want and you can take it off your website after a day.
But Chris Boothman, I just want your thought on this. Aren't we in danger, the News of the World's already closed, but aren't we in danger of actually making it very difficult for risky investigative journalism to be done in this new world of sticks?
I don't think so. I think because the framework of the law at the moment, in terms of freedom of expression, is such that it recognises that there are occasions when the ends justify the means. So there is actually a balancing act at the moment which would support those kinds of risky investigative endeavour, which actually result in something major being exposed.
Last question, it's going to go to you, Greg Dyke. Carl Bernstein, one of the 2 famous Watergate journalists, he said, what, Britain has to accept that in the end it's the British public that is part of the fault with everything that's happened with the hacking scandal, because they lapped up what he called sewer journalism for so long. Do you think that is fair, and B, that the British public is going to change?
Well, they've actually begun to not lap it up, because actually the sales of most newspapers are in decline because of the coming of the internet. No, look, there's a public interest justification that you should be able to make in all journalism. Even if I've tapped your phone, if what I'm chasing a story that is so profound, you can make an argument for it. What there isn't is the sort of stories that the News of the World have been doing. If most of the time your phone hacking is just, you're searching for something, there's no justification.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Fascinating debate. Thank you all, Jacqui Smith, Greg Dyke, Chris Boothman, for being on Hard Talk.